The New Netherland delegation had traveled to the Dutch Republic to plead with the government to help them put an end to the West India Company's mishandling of their colony. The States General agreed to help, but their ruling on the matter was delayed because of internal and external problems. For instance, Prince Willem II of Orange staged a coup on Old Amsterdam, but then he passed away and all was well again with the world. Until the English Commonwealth, wanting to end Dutch trade dominance and take all the Americas, including New Netherland, started making war sounds. And when the English passed the Act of Navigation, it was all hands on deck for the Dutch to stave off a war. I am Yvette, this is Defragged History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 6 of the story of New Amsterdam. How it started, how it ended, and everything in between. You can find links to my sources, the music, and ways to support the channel financially in the description below. And now, let's make all the pieces fit. Cornelis and Johan de Witt were sons of regent and lumber merchant Jacob de Witt and Anna van den Korput. Mom was a cousin of infamous 80 Years' War military commander Johan van den Korput. More about him in my 80 Years' War series on this channel. Do check it out. The De Witts was a powerful regents family in Dordrecht whose influence dated back to the 14th century. Jacob de Witt had been, among other things, mayor of Dordrecht, treasurer of the Synod of Dort, and ambassador to Denmark and Sweden. Uncle Andries de Witt had been the interim grand pensionary after Johan van Oldenbarneveld's capture in 1618. So let me get you up to speed here real quick. At this time, Dutch society was built up of the following classes. The nobility, counts, dukes, lords, barons, and the like had the highest status. Right next to them were the non-noble regent families, the ruling class. The second class were merchants, wealthy ship owners, landowners, lawyers, doctors, high-ranking officials, and military officers. The third were the masters of trade, large shop owners, and skippers with a considerable vessel. The second and third classes were collectively called broad burghers. The lower class was varied and also had layers. There was the middle class, the so-called narrow burghers, who were shop owners and guild members, followed by employed folk, seamen, soldiers, and laborers. And lastly, the greys, the lowest class, called greys because of the color of their clothes. They were vagabonds, beggars, ill people, widows, the unemployed, and the homeless. They made up about 10 to 20% of the population. While at this time no one in the Republic had to starve, anger about a regent's decision could cause an uprising. If the Greys rose up, the regents didn't have to worry. If the narrow burghers, or worse, the broad burghers joined in, the regents were in trouble. If the disgruntled masses organized and ended up on a regent's doorstep, a regent's worst nightmare, his house was either plundered or spared. Once a regent's house was destroyed, the family's power was gone. The De Witts were always wary of rumors of rebellion and did everything in their power to calm the people down before they marched on their homes. One day, the disgruntled masses stood on the doorstep of then-Mayor Jacob de Witt, but his stern speech dispersed the crowd. Jacob felt a regent should keep a foot on the lower class's necks and keep it there. However, this attitude only worked when the shooting companies in the city, kinda like a police force, were on their side. If they weren't, well, buckle up. These were the lessons Cornelis and Johan learned growing up. To prepare the brothers for their inevitable regent future, the De Witt brothers studied law at the University of Leiden and made the customary so-called grand tour through Europe to learn all about international relations and diplomacy. After the tour, Johan started a law practice in The Hague and Cornelis became a schepen of Dordrecht, a member of the city's government, and later a member of the Admiralty of Rotterdam. Their father had backed Prince Maurits of Orange and his decision to stop Johan van Oldenbarneveld's seemingly destructive reign. But after Prince Frederik Hendrik of Orange made the stadholderates hereditary, Jacob had become a staatsgezinde, a republican, and he and his sons were leaders of the Dutch States Party, named after the States General. After Prince Willem II of Orange imprisoned Jacob de Witt and 5 other regents at Loevestein Castle, members of the States Party were also called Loevesteiners. The primary goal of the party was to sustain, or better yet, increase the power of Holland in the States General. Meanwhile, the Princes of Orange and their supporters, the Prinsgezinden or Orangists, fought to maintain a republic where power was divided equally between the states. They were, therefore, always at odds with Holland, the Republic's most powerful state. The Republican brothers were quite pleased to have a stadholderless or Orange Nassau-free period and called it an era of ware vrijheid or true freedom. While the De Witt family lost nearly everything because of the prince, after Willem's death all members were quickly exonerated and restored in their powers. Jacob always warned his sons, never trust an Orange. They'd certainly heed his advice, though the current Prince of Orange was a 2-year-old toddler. On December 21st, 1650, Johan de Witt succeeded Nicolaas Ruysch as pensionary of Dordrecht and was the city's delegate to the States of Holland Assembly. He often stood in for Adriaan Pauw, the Grand Pensionary, during his absence and prepared to take over the wheel. Over in the English Commonwealth, the Rum Parliament, made up of members of the Long Parliament who remained after the military purge, used their recently passed Act of Navigation to reinstate a long-claimed English right. The commanders of the English men of war should force all passing foreign ships to dip their colours, that is their flags, to salute the English flag. England wanted to show everyone who was boss and claim its undoubted right to the dominion of the surrounding seas. Hello, have you met the Dutch? On May 29, 1652, Lieutenant Admiral Maarten Harpertszoon Tromp, commander of the 42-vessel Dutch fleet, and Admiral Robert Blake, head of the more heavily armed English fleet, waved at each other in the Straits of Dover. The English admiral, aged 50, had only recently become a mariner. The Dutch admiral, aged 54, had been a mariner since the age of 9. Blake on the James had come to convoy Tromp's fleet and waited for the admiral on the Brederode to strike the flag. Tromp lowered the sails to indicate he was simply waiting for a Dutch fleet to convoy home. He sent a sailor to the flag, but didn't give the order to lower it. The States General had given the Lieutenant Admiral strict instructions to ignore the Navigation Act, to protect Dutch vessels from foreign searches, deal with English naval aggression, and to refuse to strike his flag to English ships of war. But to not light the powder keg, he should steer clear of the English. That was easier said than done, obviously. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Tromp lowered a sloop to open a line of communication with Blake. Admiral Blake decided Tromp had maneuvered into attack position and opened fire. One cannonball struck the Dutch flag. Admiral Tromp, realizing Blake wanted to sink his ship, ordered return fire, and the Battle of Dover was on. Each side won strikes, and with all the close-range shooting, the scenes were incredibly brutal, with blood and guts flying everywhere. At last, a flustered Blake fell back to the Thames River. The boastful Admiral Tromp put a broom at his masthead and declared he'd cleared the channel of English vessels. So, who was to blame for tossing a lit match into the powder keg? According to eyewitnesses in Calais, France, watching it all unfold, the English had been the aggressors, with Tromp being remarkably late in returning fire. After this incident, a shadow war between the Dutch and English quietly escalated until on July 7, 1652, the States General ordered Tromp to attack everything. On July 10th, the English leaders officially declared war on the Dutch Republic. Not sure why the Dutch thought they stood a chance. Yes, they could count on a much larger fleet, including company vessels, but the English had been building a new fleet of larger warships with way more cannons on board. Also, after the Peace of Münster, the 5 Dutch admiralties had reduced their naval forces. They'd have to play catch-up. The States General and the East and West India Companies had to drop everything and defend their trade routes. Every available ship was rigged for battle. Grand Pensionary Adriaan Pauw sighed. The English are about to attack a mountain of gold. We are about to storm a mountain of iron. This Anglo-Dutch War, a down-and-dirty trade war, was fought entirely at sea. Unlike in the 80 Years' War, which had only ended 4 years earlier, there were no besieged towns, no troops scouring farmland for supplies, and no sacking of villages. The English wanted to disrupt Dutch worldwide trade, the Republic's main source of income, and by tanking their economy, prevent their buildup of a war machine. Admiral Blake and his 60-ship fleet attacked Dutch fishermen in the North Sea and trading vessels from the Baltic, while Admiral George Ayscue and his small force intercepted East and West Indiamen in the English Channel. The Anglo-Dutch War's battlefields were chaotic and mainly involved boarding and capturing enemy ships. The English fleet, ordered to stay together, constantly scattered, while Tromp battled the weather more than the English. After meager results, Admiral Tromp was suspended, and the supreme command was handed to Vice Admiral Witt Corneliszoon de Witt, who'd been released from prison after the death of Prince Willem II of Orange. The main American delegate, Adriaen van der Donck, had just pulled the plug on the West India Company, lingering on life support, but the Anglo-Dutch War resuscitated the company and brought it roaring back to life. The States General needed ships, more ships, all the ships. And just like that, the company directors were back, large and in charge, and immediately forced the States General to overturn its rulings on New Netherland. The colonies were at stake. Now was not the time for experiments. And so, in the middle of the crisis, the States General reversed Director-General Pieter Stuyvesant's recall and ordered Van der Donck to hand back the letter ordering the Director-General home. In an instant, the cause of Van der Donck and other Americans asking for colonial reform was reduced to nothing. They were labeled radicals and put on a watch list. The lawyer was detained and was denied permission to return to America. His family left for Manhattan without him. In August, a Zeeland convoy of hastily converted merchantmen was commanded by Vice-Commandeur Michiel Adriaanszoon de Ruyter. The 45-year-old de Ruyter had retired earlier that year, but the Zeeland Admiralty appealed to his sense of duty and he reluctantly returned to sea to command the convoy. Admiral George Ayscue sent his 9 fastest and strongest warships to intercept this fleet. Cue the Battle of Plymouth. De Ruyter had the upper hand, ignored the 9 ships, and surrounded Ayscue's abandoned section of the fleet. The Dutch convoy made a clean getaway, and Ayscue was relieved of command. De Ruyter was hailed a hero, a Zeelandic sea lion, the Zeeuwse Zeeleeuw. Try saying that 3 times fast. Zeeuwse Zeeleeuw, Zeeuwse Zeeleeuw, Zeeuwse Zeeleeuw, whatever. De Ruyter went on to fight many more battles. A much deeper dive into the war will one day come in a future series about the Witt Brothers and the Anglo-Dutch War. Meanwhile, Witte de Witt, with Ayscue out of the picture, pulled his fleet together to rule the seas. On October 8, 1652, the Dutch attacked the English fleet near the Thames River. However, they had to abandon the Battle of Kentish Knock with significant losses and casualties. After this, English Parliament, believing that the Dutch were done for, took 20 of Blake's ships to reinforce their Mediterranean fleet. Admiral Blake had 42 men of war left, while the Dutch reinforced their fleet. And so, in December, an absolved Admiral Tromp defeated the English in the Battle of Dungeness. Now the Dutch blockaded the English ports and controlled the Channel, the North Sea, and the Mediterranean. Oliver Cromwell told Parliament, "I don't know, just a wild thought. Maybe we should open peace negotiations with the Dutch?" But Parliament wasn't quite ready to disembark yet. In fact, they couldn't agree on anything ever. Self-rule was hard, yo. And with only a bare majority of yeas, the talks weren't serious and the war raged on. Meanwhile, the English got right on repairing their fleet and revising their strategy. The exiled Adriaen van der Donck roamed around in Old Netherland and even returned to university to receive his Supremus in Jure degree, which allowed him to appear before the Dutch Hoge Raad, the Supreme Court. When he appealed to the States General to release him, the West India Company issued a warning to all vessels: transport this man and suffer the consequences. Van der Donck stalked into Company HQ in Amsterdam to have a little chat with the company officials. What gives? They unleashed on him. He was a notorious ringleader, an illegitimate representative of a lawless and mutinous rabble. The Jonker pleaded again with the States General. His farm in America was going fast to ruin. Why this extraordinary civil banishment? My ancestors helped liberate Breda, for Pete's sake. No dice. His cause was lost. Left alone, with nowhere to go, he wrote a book to promote his beloved colony, Beschrijvingen van Nieuw-Nederland, a description of New Netherland, providing detailed accounts of the geography, Native Americans, and colonial life. Until recently, his works were ignored because they were written in Dutch. The description wasn't even properly translated until the 1990s. As a result, William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation won out as the go-to early American history text. However, his book got shelved while the Anglo-Dutch War raged. The government wanted to avoid attracting attention to the vulnerable colony the New Englanders could invade. Amid the darkness, there was a glimmer of hope. Van der Donck finally had one of his wishes fulfilled. As of February 2nd, 1653, with the signing of a municipal charter, New Amsterdam became a city. New York City celebrates its birthday on this date. From now on, New Amsterdam's government consisted of 2 burgemeesters or mayors, 5 schepenen or municipal executives, and a schout or sheriff, just as they did in Old Amsterdam and other towns in the Republic. These offices had to be filled by election, but Stuyvesant, paranoid of another rebel uprising, ignored the orders of the States General and appointed the men himself. None of them were reformers, naturally, but the people accepted the appointments. On February 20th, 1653, 7 men met at the Herberg, the tavern, a 2-story stone building, to swear an oath of service to the States General and God. The bell in the courtyard solemnly sounded the change of government. Despite the dramatic implications, it was all very demure, very mindful. Their honors, the magistrates of the newly incorporated city of New Amsterdam, transacted their first brief piece of business, putting their signatures on a statement. Herewith to inform everybody that they shall hold their regular meetings in the house hitherto called the City Tavern, henceforth the City Hall, on Monday mornings from 9 o'clock, to hear there all questions of difference between litigants and decide them as best they can. In February 1653, a report attributed to Mohegan Chief Uncas started circulating in Connecticut, New England. It said New Netherland Director-General Stuyvesant was collaborating with Narragansett chiefs Pesicus, Mixum, and Ninegret. He was supplying their tribe with weapons, so they would join forces against the English. At the same time, a messenger from 9 chiefs in the Manhattan area came to Stamford saying, "The Dutch governor has earnestly solicited the Indians in these parts to kill all the English, but we have all refused to be hired by him, for the English have done us no harm." Well, to the credit of the New Englanders, they weren't sure if any of this was true. Indians were nothing if not cunning. Director-General Stuyvesant vehemently and publicly denied these reports. The Massachusetts Council decided to do their due diligence and sent 3 messengers to question the 3 Narragansett chiefs about Stuyvesant. The men flatly denied the Director-General ever made such a proposal. Chief Mixum answered, "I speak unfeignedly from my heart and say without dissimulation that I know of no such plot against the English, my friends, implicating either the Dutch governor or any other person. Though I be poor, it is not goods, guns, powder, nor shot that shall draw me to such a plot as this against the English, my friends. If the Dutch governor had made known any such intention to me, I would have told it without delay to the English, my friends." Chief Pesicus was even more emphatic in his denial. "For what I speak with my mouth, I speak from my heart. The Dutch governor did never propound any such thing unto us. Do you think we are mad? They'd signed an agreement with the English who'd live close by, not with the Dutch far away. Have we not reason in us? How can the Dutch shelter us, being so remote, against the power of the English, our friends, we living close by the doors of the English, our friends? We do profess, we abhor such things." Ninegret said, "I utterly deny that there has been any agreement made between the Dutch governor and myself to fight against the English. I did never hear the Dutchmen say they would go and fight against the English, nor did I hear the Indians say they would join with them." He had heard from other tribes that Dutch troops had been arriving, apparently to fight the English, but do they think we are mad? And I would for a few guns and swords sell our lives and the lives of our wives and children? A little later he added that yes, he had visited New Amsterdam because he was ill and wanted to see a doctor there. He got his treatment, but when he wanted to meet with the director, it was winter time and I stood a great part of a winter day knocking at the director's door and he would neither open it nor suffer others to open it to let me in. I was not wont to fund such carriage from the English, my friends. Mixum and Pesicus added later, "We desire to know where you had this news, that there was such a league made betwixt the Dutch and us, and also to know our accusers." As it turned out, a few Englishmen paid off some Indian chiefs to make false accusations and trick the New England governors into attacking New Netherland. The New England Council was like, case closed. However, maybe? Director-General Stuyvesant was like, come at me, see what happens. No, seriously, send delegates to come see me, or we can come to Boston to talk about all the things. The council decided to send 3 bigwigs to Manhattan. At the same time, they ordered the preparation of an army of 500 men, should God called the colonies to make war against the Dutch. The States General reported it was certainly informed that New Netherland is in great danger and imminently exposed to invasion. The West India Company dusted off the privateering manual of the 80 Years' War and decided that 5 or 6 ordinary but well-manned frigates should use Manhattan as a base for attacking English colonies. The company directors wrote to Director-General Pieter Stuyvesant, "So this new border agreement, yay, but are you sure the Hartford Treaty means that we have nothing to fear from them? You know what, we'll send you weapons and ammunition, so you can arm all freemen, soldiers and sailors. Do inspect all the forts. If the New Englanders join in this Anglo-Dutch War, you should enlist the Indians, who we here are no fans of the Englishmen. Make sure that the merchants and inhabitants are safe and treat them with kindness, so they don't go running home and depopulate the colony. Also, fortify the most important villages with ramparts and palisades." The company directors added prophetically, "Once these colonies become permanently established, once the ships of New Netherland ride on every part of the ocean, then numbers, now looking to that coast with eager eyes, shall be allured to embark for your island." Yeah, tell me something I don't know. They began to fear the enemy among them, the English in the Dutch colony. Sure, they'd sworn allegiance to the States General and the company, but when pressed, wouldn't they just team up with their countrymen and help with the takeover? Stuyvesant said to invite them to aid us would be bringing the Trojan horse within our walls. Stuyvesant knew he couldn't stop the English once they made a move and wrote very friendly letters to the governors. "Sure, our home countries are fighting, but trade between our colonies should just go on peacefully. What do you say, besties?" Meanwhile, he prepared all the defenses against a possible attack. I'm sure you've heard of Wall Street. Yep, the Director General was gonna build a wall. The New England delegation of distinguished gentlemen got a warm welcome in New Amsterdam, but these honorable men unleashed an inquisition. They were only there to collect incriminating evidence against the Dutch. As per Old England rules, New Netherland Director Pieter Stuyvesant was guilty until he proved himself innocent. Stuyvesant was fuming, but found his moment of zen and remained most friendly. "No, we're not plotting to attack the English colonies. Why would we do that?" The New England agents huffed they didn't believe him and ended the visit without giving him a chance to clear his name. At 9 p.m. they bounced, something election something, but they left with a warning. "If we find out you use the Anglo-Dutch War as an excuse to mess with, or have the Indians mess with the English folks, you'll have another thing coming." The following morning, the director fired off a letter to Boston refuting all the New Englanders' complaints. "Your worships, stop it with the false reports and fake news. If your honors had bothered to stick around, you'd have known that we have nothing but peaceful and friendly intentions." On their way home, the New England agents swung by Flushing, Stamford and New Haven to collect the mountains of evidence against Director-General Stuyvesant. Well, they found a teeny tiny molehill. Stuyvesant had told Robert Coe and William Alford that if the English attacked him, he tried to get the Indians to help him. Those have been orders from the West India Company directors and were a defensive measure, not offensive. After hearing the not-so-damning report, the General Assembly at Boston voted they were not called upon to make a present war with the Dutch. However, 6 of the 8 commissioners from New Haven and Connecticut wanted war. They looked at the awesome potential of the Hudson River, unlocking the potential of future trade and wealth in the unexplored realms beyond. Also, being the direct next-door neighbors of New Netherland, they feared Stuyvesant and his rogue Indians were coming for them first. But Connecticut couldn't go to war without Massachusetts Bay's help. They urged that, by war, if no other means will serve, the Dutch at and about the Manhattans, who have been and still are like to prove injurious, may be removed. They sent Director-General Stuyvesant a defiant reply. "Your confident denials of the barbarous plot with which you are charged will weigh little in the balance against the evidence, so that we must still require and seek due satisfaction and security." Massachusetts Bay, meanwhile, convinced of Stuyvesant's peaceful intentions, said, "We cannot act in so weighty a concernment as to send forth men to shed blood, unless satisfied that God calls for it. And then it must be clear and not doubtful." The colony's representatives and the General Court clashed hard, but even after a vague compromise, no reason was found for war. Still, Stamford and Fairfield started raising a volunteer army, and some weren't willing to wait for Stuyvesant to strike. They'd strike first. Infamous Pequot war captain John Underhill had fled New England and now lived in Hampstead on Long Island. But the warrior was growing restless. In the not yet ratified Treaty of Hartford, Stuyvesant had ceded 2/3 of Long Island to New England. In April 1653, Underhill figured now was the time to seize all of Long Island for his fellow countrymen, the English. He raised the parliamentary colours at Hampstead and Flushing and proclaimed that Stuyvesant had been guilty of unlawful taxation, conspiracy with Indians, violation of conscience and other obnoxious conduct. He told the residents, "You are called upon to abjure the iniquitous government of Pieter Stuyvesant over the inhabitants residing on Long Island. His rule is too grievous for any brave Englishman and good Christian to tolerate any longer. All honest hearts that seek the glory of God and His peace and prosperity are exhorted to throw off this tyrannical yoke. Accept and submit ye then to the Parliament of England, and beware of becoming traitors to one another for the sake of your own quiet and welfare." However, the locals at Hampstead and Flushing were like, nah mate. And Stuyvesant arrested Underhill for hoisting the parliamentary colours and addressing a seditious paper to the people of Long Island. He considered hanging him, but, desperate to keep the peace with New England, freed him after a short imprisonment. So that was a mistake. Underhill went to Rhode Island and convinced their General Assembly to declare war against New Netherland. Rhode Island gave Thomas Baxter a letter of marque and he became a privateer, but he attacked both Dutch and English vessels. Then, on May 19, 1653, Boston made Underhill captain of the land forces and told him to relieve the English on Long Island from the cruel tyranny of the Dutch power at the Manhattoes and to bring the Dutch to conformity to the Commonwealth of England. They also appointed William Dyer and Edward Hull commanders on the sea and ordered to take all Dutch ships and vessels as shall come into his power and to defend himself from the Dutch and all enemies of the Commonwealth of England. At sea, Edward Hull seized the French vessel. No harm done to the Dutch there. Underhill set out for Fort de Goede Hoop, a Dutch enclave smack dab in the middle of Connecticut with 20 volunteers. All that was left of the Dutch in the Connecticut Valley was this wrecked fort and 30 acres of land. Underhill claimed the fort by right of conquest and sold deeds to the land to 2 different buyers. Then he disbanded his valiant army. In early February 1653, Lieutenant Admiral Tromp successfully escorted a convoy of merchant ships through the Channel to the Atlantic Ocean. He sailed to La Rochelle in France to make repairs, get supplies, and await the arrival of merchant ships from the Atlantic. High winds and rough seas delayed his departure by 3 days. Then, on February 28th, he saw Admiral Robert Blake's fleet moving to cut him off. Since Tromp had the weather gauge, he signaled for a general attack. For 3 days, the fleets traded blows. The English failed to break the Dutch line, but the Dutch ran out of powder and shot and had no way to get resupplied. On the 4th day, the English got ready for another attempt, but Tromp was gone. He left 12 warships and some merchantmen behind. Both sides claimed a victory of the Battle of Portland, or the 3 days battle, but it was Tromp who had left the field, and Blake who'd captured a few dozen Dutch merchantmen and some 8 Dutch warships. 2 weeks later, on March 14, 1653, Commandeur Johan van Galen wiped the waves with the English Mediterranean fleet in the Battle of Leghorn near Livorno. Van Galen was mortally wounded and died a few days later. Around this time, the States of Holland sent a detailed peace plan to the English Parliament. After a fierce debate, there were just enough votes to send back a response. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By now, Cromwell was doing his best to get the Rum Parliament moving and making decisions, but with the common cause, removing the king, gone, no one agreed on practically anything. When they ignored Cromwell's helpful suggestions, he got so angry that he apparently shouted, "You are no parliament! I say you are no parliament! I will put an end to your sitting!" He dissolved Parliament with the help of some 40 musketeers and established the nominated assembly made up of hand-picked religious men, aka the Parliament of Saints, or more commonly as Barebone's Parliament, after one of its members, Praise God Barebone. Yep, that was his name. In June, during the two-day Battle of the Gabbard near Newport, the English Navy sank or captured 17 of Admiral Tromp's warships, sending the rest scurrying home. The English, having suffered minimal damage, set up a 120-ship blockade along the Republic's coast. It was a disaster for the Republic. The Dutch got their grain, wheat and rye from the Baltic to feed their large cities. The blockade drove prices up and many poor people starved. All the Dutch admirals put their differences aside, and there was a ton of drama, believe me, and wrote a joint statement to the States General. We need heavier ships, more cannons, more crews, now. But the States General felt it was best there was peace. Johan de Witt, subbing for Grand Pensionary Adriaan Pauw, persuaded the States General to send a delegation to London to negotiate peace terms. England was open to the idea. While the English Navy reigned supreme, the Dutch Navy had better numbers and just kept coming back for more. It was getting spendy. The talks started where they'd left off in 1652. The Dutch wanted access to trade in the American colonies. The English demanded payment for damages caused by the Dutch. The English never forgave nor forgot the Amboyna massacre, the killing of 10 English traders by Dutch soldiers on the Southeast Asia island of Ambon 3 decades earlier. When rumors reached London that the Dutch had hired Indians to massacre New England families while at church, a clever printer made a pamphlet to stir up more hatred of the Dutch. It was called The Second Part of the Amboyna Tragedy, or A True Account of a Most Bloody, Treacherous and Cruel Plot of the Dutch in New Netherland in America, tending to a total ruin and massacre of the English colonies in New England, extracted from diverse letters lately written out of New England to different merchants in London. The pamphlet was filled to the brim with run-of-the-mill wartime disinformation. The Dutch were accused of a devilish project to incite the Native Americans into a coordinated attack on all the New England colonies. Speaking of the Indians, they were condemned as bloody people, fit instruments for so horrid a design. Thank goodness for an English colonist who had, in one night, cut off 1,400 of them. This whole plot was evidence that wickedness ran in every Dutchman's veins. Amboyna's treacherous cruelty extending itself from the east to the West Indies, running in its proper channel of Dutch blood. The West India Company directors had this most infamous and lying libel translated and sent to New Netherland Director-General Pieter Stuyvesant and his council. They said, "We wish that your honors may see what stratagems that nation employs, not only to irritate the populace, but the whole world if possible, and to stir it up against us." Meanwhile, Connecticut was experiencing some nasty Indian conflicts and attacks on settlers. Things were getting pretty scary. Can't you see? Until New Netherland fell under English rule, the Indians would always be a threat. The whole conspiracy spread through New England, where everyone got ready for war. The New Netherland magistrates jumped on the orders of the West India Company to build better defenses. Pieter Stuyvesant joined them in session. While he hated the idea of a city government, in a crisis it was nice to share the burden. The government's first order was to repair Fort Amsterdam. With the town's northern border, the direction from which they expected an English assault, undefended, the second order was to surround the greater part of the city with a high stockade and a small breastwork. The magistrates fundraised among the town's wealthiest residents. Director-General Stuyvesant matched the top donation of 150 guilders. A crier was sent out, declaring that the town council was asking for bids to carry out the work, but all residents, without exception, had to work on the wall. If they didn't, they'd be fined, lose their citizenship, and be banished. Construction went underway in early July 1653. The wall and ditch ran from the East River to the North now Hudson River along the present site of Wall Street. It had two gates, the water gate on the shore of the East River and the land gate at today's Broadway. The palisade was made of 12-foot oak logs, 18 inches in diameter, sharpened at the upper end and sunk 3 feet into the ground. It was fortified by a 4-foot high rampart. Now you know, the wall along Wall Street wasn't built to keep out the Indians, but to keep out the English. But the Dutch were Dutching when it became clear the English weren't descending on New Amsterdam just yet, and they refused to continue to fund it. Stuyvesant now entirely relied on the richer citizens to finish it. After the wall was finished, all citizens did guard rotations. A frigate in the harbor was ready to sail at a moment's notice, while its guns were kept loaded day and night. Meanwhile, in the Republic, Johan de Witt had officially become the Grand Pensionary and got right on enhancing the navy. But Admiral Tromp, beyond exhausted, told the States General, "You are putting more on my shoulders than I can really bear. It has all become too much for one man." So maybe having a stadtholder being commander-in-chief was better? Never mind. Tromp said, "You must also realize what will happen if the head of the fleet is somehow taken out. You can imagine how the highest flag officers will behave in that case." Well, how prophetic. With economic collapse imminent in the Republic, the Dutch deployed all available ships in a desperate attempt to break the blockade. Generally, they were unsuccessful. On August 3, 1653, Admiral Tromp sailed from the Maas with about 70 ships to lure the English fleet south, so another fleet could break out at Texel. 5 days later, the English finally took the bait and sank 2 Dutch ships before dark. However, Tromp brilliantly maneuvered his fleet to the north of the English, and now Vice Admiral Witt de Witt's 27-ship squadron was able to sneak out at Texel. The admirals rendezvoused the following day off Scheveningen, next to the small village of Ter Heide. The Dutch then had 5 squadrons: Tromp, de Witt, Vice Admiral Johan Evertsen, Acting Vice Admiral Pieter Florissen, and Commodore Michiel de Ruyter. Around 7 a.m. on August 10th, the Dutch got the weather gauge and attacked. The fleets moved through each other 4 times. The big English ships outgunned the Dutch smaller ones. After several fierce clashes, the fleets on both sides were so battered and scattered that they first had to recover and regroup. But disaster had struck. Admiral Tromp was hit in the chest by a musket ball from an English sharpshooter. He died, aged 55. De Ruyter moved fast to keep Tromp's death a secret from the rest of the fleet to ensure high morale, and kept the admiral's flag flying on the flagship. The battle continued. By late afternoon, the Dutch had lost 10 ships either sunk or captured, with many more too damaged to continue fighting. Some 24 to 26 captains were no longer willing to take part in the battle and stayed outside cannon range. De Witt ordered them to hold their ground and fired at them as they fled north. In the end, de Witt's remaining fleet was forced to fall back to Texel, and the Vice Admiral held the cowardly captains responsible for losing the battle. Except many of these captains' ships had been crippled. The English fleet was so badly damaged, and with many wounded men in desperate need of care, they returned to port for repairs and restocking. They couldn't hold the blockade. While the English won the Battle of Scheveningen, aka Slag bij Ter Heide, the Dutch achieved their strategic objective, breaking the blockade. That month, Oliver Cromwell dusted off an old Holland plan. The 2 countries should unite under one government. Hell no! We just finished an 80-year fight for our independence. What about an alliance between the Protestant powers of Europe and France against the Catholic powers? It's gonna be awesome. Hell no! The Dutch wouldn't jeopardize their peace with Spain to assist England in their conquest of Spanish America. The talks were going nowhere fast. The war raged on. After the Battle of Scheveningen, the Dutch deployed smaller warships to raid and capture some 440 English merchant vessels. The Dutch Encirclement crippled English trade worldwide. The VOC blocked English trade in Southeast Asia, Dutch privateers blocked the English from doing business in the Mediterranean, and Denmark, a Dutch ally, blocked the English shipping in the Baltic. Meanwhile, the Dutch were constantly raided by English privateers. While the Dutch merchant fleet was 3 times larger than the English, it lost some 1,200 ships of all sizes to these legalized pirates. In the end, both countries suffered so much economic damage that both wanted peace. England had 2 new proposals. All royalists had to be expelled from the Republic, and the Dutch should stop supporting Denmark in its war against Sweden. The Dutch countered, "Pull the Navigation Act and we'll regulate commerce outside Europe." No, this was going nowhere. Again. In December, it was revealed that the bare-bones parliament had too many radical Fifth Monarchy men in them, so Cromwell's supporters dissolved it in a well-timed coup. A new constitution called the Instrument of Government was adopted and a protectorate established. Cromwell was made Lord Protector for life to undertake the chief magistracy and the administration of government. Thus ended England's Republican experiment. The Lord Protector and his Western design, his grandiose plan to capture all of the Americas and create a great Atlantic empire, wanted to stop fighting the Dutch, so he could fight the Spanish. He prioritized ending the Anglo-Dutch War and accepted that the 25 agreed articles would form the basis for peace. At last, late in 1653, 4 years after his arrival, Adriaen van der Donck received permission to leave for Manhattan. But it came at a price. The WIC, nothing if not vindictive, told him his lawyering days in the colony were done. He was barred from public life and his legal practice, because the colony had no lawyer who could challenge him. Well, there was another lawyer in the colony, ex-vice-director Lubbert van Dinklage, but Stuyvesant had forced him into retirement for backing Van der Donck's mission. For the first time in his life, the lawyer described himself as wholly disheartened and cast down. He submitted another petition, in which he humbly asked to be allowed to return and promising he wouldn't accept an office while there and obey every command of the Director-General. This request was granted. There was no fanfare or parade on the Jonker's return to Manhattan. While most New Amsterdam residents considered him a hero, nobody dared to poke the bear Stuyvesant. Van der Donck's mission had succeeded until the Anglo-Dutch War destroyed it all. But the city's new magistrates, who owed him their jobs, considered him their leader in the reform movement. Van der Donck's final known request to Stuyvesant was access to colonial records so he could complete his book, still awaiting publication in Old Amsterdam. Stuyvesant turned him down, citing the wary company directors who warned him two-faced Van der Donck could cause new troubles and turn the company's own weapons upon itself. Van der Donck disappeared from the official records, suggesting he was done. But a man with his particular set of skills couldn't lay low for long. It appears he meddled behind the scenes. Revolt was brewing, again, and his fingerprints were all over it. New Amsterdam had been a city for nearly a year, but there was still friction between the city government and company man Stuyvesant. They mostly bickered about taxation and their father's arbitrary rule. Those in the rest of New Netherland had vowed fealty to the States General, but were still subject to the rule of the West India Company and paid taxes to the Director-General. When Stuyvesant declared the delegates had no authority to act or even meet to tackle such questions, many demanded a proper popular government and that laws were made with the people's consent. Since the company didn't protect them against the Indians, what were their tax dollars even for? The loudest protests came from English towns of the Dutch section of Long Island in particular. They'd shut up because of the Anglo-Dutch War out of fear of upsetting Stuyvesant, but no more. The residents of these outlying towns assembled to declare that since they had to pay for their own defenses, they'd no longer be obligated to pay taxes to the company. Stuyvesant was livid. All this time, he'd relied on these loyal English residents to back him up against the angry Dutch residents. Their sudden opposition felt like a stab in the back. Et tu, brute? He informed the convention that its conduct smelled of rebellion, of contempt of his high authority and commission. Now you're getting it. Now that the English were teaming up against him, he proclaimed that any convention must include representatives of both Dutch and English towns. Well, the English told the Dutch towns to come have a nice cold beer. Let's join forces against the Director-General and file a formal complaint together. The Dutch towns were like, we'll bring snacks. On December 16, 1653, George Baxter and James Hubbard led a meeting of 19 delegates from 8 towns gathered at the City Hall in New Amsterdam. The 4 Dutch towns were New Amsterdam, Breukelen, Brooklyn, New Amersfoort, Flatlands, and Midwoud or Vlakebos, Flatbush. The 4 English towns were Vlissingen, Flushing, Middelburg, Newtown, Heemstede, Hempstead, and Gravesende, Gravesend. Stuyvesant sent his councilman Dr. Johannes La Montagne and Cornelis van Werkhoven to represent him. The delegates showed them the door. Nah, mate, this ain't a company meeting. This is a States General meeting. Only representatives of the mayors and schepenen were allowed. New Netherlands English Secretary Baxter wrote the meeting's notes and drew up a list of grievances in English called The Humble Remonstrance and Petition of the Colonies and Villages in this New Netherland Province. They complained about how random and uncaring the government was. The West India Company collected taxes and left them to fight their own battles with the Indians. They proclaimed, "This is contrary to the granted privilege of the Netherland government and odious to every free-born man, and especially so to those whom God has placed in a free state and newly settled lands, who are entitled to claim laws not transcending, but resembling as near as possible those of the Netherlands." For a long time, historians thought that since the Remonstrance was written in English, the English came up with the concept of no taxation without representation, and that they were inspired by the Anglo-Dutch War. No and no. This document followed all Dutch legal forms, and the complaint was years in the making. Adriaan van der Donk's long rebellion against the company had taken root. In fact, historians now agree it was probably written by van der Donk. Stuyvesant certainly thought so. The company, however, was less sure. The Director-General was, I want to say, annoyed with the complaint, but that's not strong enough a word. He said, on pain of highest displeasure, so we'll go with that. He first mocked the representatives, who apparently needed Englishmen to tell them what to do. The most ancient colony of Manhattan, the colonies of Rensselaerswijk and Staten Island, and the settlements at Beverwijk and on the South River are too prudent to subscribe to all that has been projected by an Englishman. As if among the Netherlands nation there is no one sagacious and expert enough to draw up a remonstrance to the director and the council. The protesters didn't take the bait. Then the director ordered the group to disperse, claiming that the directors of the West India Company were absolute and general lords and masters of this province, and we derive our authority from God and from the company, not from a few ignorant subjects, and we alone can call the inhabitants together. The people had no inherent right to take part in the government, and that the convention itself was illegal. The petition was denied, but the people wouldn't shut up and did everything they could to make their views known. They sent an agent named François Lebleu to the Republic with a list of complaints about how Stuyvesant was ruining things. Lebleu had to ask the States General for help in fixing the problems and to do everything he could to get the changes they wanted. He was not welcomed with open arms. "We're a little busy with all the war making here." In early 1654, while things weren't looking so hot for Old Netherlands, New Netherland wasn't doing much better. As always in wartime, many pirates and robbers flooded the scene. They terrorized Long Island shores and committed horrific acts against its defenseless people. The English residents in New Netherland were primed for revolt, with the Dutch grumbling loudly along with them. Director-General Stuyvesant tried to please everyone by quickly sending some ships after those pirates, who turned out to be privateersmen serving the Commonwealth of England. New Netherlanders figured the Trojan horse-like English had in fact now teamed up with the pirates. So Stuyvesant issued a decree. Anyone caught hiding the outlaws faced banishment and the seizure of their property. A third of the New Netherland men were appointed Minutemen ready for duty, but everyone was called to assist in the colony's defense. To make sure there was no misunderstanding, Stuyvesant told the Connecticut governors it was all about protecting their trade and punishing thieves, not for any anti-English funny business. Meanwhile, in South America, the Dutch in New Holland, as Dutch Brazil was really called, could no longer get military support from the home country because everyone and everything was needed in the Anglo-Dutch War. And so the Portuguese drove the Dutch out of New Holland at last. On January 26, 1654, after 25 years of Dutch rule, the colony surrendered at the capitulation of Taborda. The Portuguese promised to behave, but most people left for other Dutch places in the West Indies or went back to Europe. Those in the Republic couldn't believe this had happened. To be fair, ever since Johan Maurits of Nassau left, New Holland had been going downhill. The Moradores attacks killed the sugar trade, and the only thing that sustained them there was a sense of pride that they'd kept Portugal busy for decades. In the end, it was simply Verzuimd Brasil, neglected Brazil. Naturally, some New Hollanders ended up in the other neglected colony, New Netherland. But other, less friendly folks were on their way to the Dutch North American colony. The volunteer armies in Connecticut complained that Massachusetts Bay wasn't sending them backup, so they appealed to Oliver Cromwell in Old England instead to send men in arms. The petition prayed that the Dutch be either removed or, so far at least, subjected, that the colonies may be free from injurious affronts and secured against the dangers and mischievous effects which daily grow upon them by their plotting with the Indians and furnishing them with arms against the English. Wouldn't grabbing that land at the mouth of the Hudson fit perfectly in Cromwell's so-called Western design, his plan for a huge Atlantic empire? Cromwell liked the sheer grandiosity of the plan. With no Anglo-Dutch peace treaty in sight, Cromwell decided to bring the war against the Dutch Republic into the New World. He agreed to the destruction of a nation with which the English cannot either mingle or set under their government, nor so much as live near, without danger of their lives and all their comforts in this world. He would send out 2 or 3 frigates and urge Massachusetts that utmost assistance may be given for gaining the Manhattoes and other places under Dutch control. Major Robert Sedgwick and Captain John Leverett would lead 5 ships on a transatlantic mission. They were told to land in a good New England harbor, enlist the colony's help to fight the Dutch, and wipe them all out. Secretary John Thurlow wrote, "Being come to the Manhattoes, you shall by surprise, open force, or otherwise endeavor to take the place. You have power to give fair quarter, in case it be rendered upon summons without opposition. If the Lord give his blessing, you shall not use cruelty to the inhabitants, but encourage those who are willing to remain under the English government, and give liberty to others who transport themselves to Europe." Some New England colonies responded quite eagerly to Cromwell's appeal. New Haven promised up to 500 men. New Plymouth ordered 50 men into service, but said, "We concur in hostile measures against our ancient Dutch neighbors only in reference unto the national quarrel." Massachusetts was reluctant, but at last consented to raise 500 volunteers against the Dutch. The moment New Netherland Director-General Pieter Stuyvesant heard about the planned expedition, he immediately assembled his council. Death is upon us. The Dutch couldn't offer resistance. New Amsterdam would be assimilated. After agonizing over it, it was decided to enlist a force of 70 men, silently and without beat of drum, and to gather supplies to withstand the siege. The pending doom turned everyone in New Amsterdam into patriots. They banded together and got out their shovels to work on strengthening the fortifications. In February 1654, unbeknownst to everyone, Lord Protector Cromwell sent Major Robert Sedgwick and Captain John Leverett on their way to Boston with 900 foot and 1 cavalry squadron. Their transatlantic journey hit some bad weather, and Cromwell's force was severely delayed and didn't arrive in Massachusetts Bay until June. And then, just as they were ready to leave to invade New Netherland, there arrived a ship from London, bringing with her diverse printed proclamations of peace between the English and the Dutch. The war took a heavy toll on those in the Republic. Shipping was down, trade was down, jobs were hard to find, many houses in Amsterdam stood empty, and beggars flooded the streets. The Dutch had no choice but to accept Lord Protector Cromwell's terms. Still, they fought for a good deal. Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt in particular skillfully employed diplomacy to secure the best treaty he could. Peace negotiations were concluded in March 1654, but just as the treaty was ready for signing, 2 more issues were raised. First, the Dutch asked for the King of Denmark, their ally, to be included in the treaty. Second, the English demanded that 3-year-old Prince Willem III of Orange was excluded from future government appointments. No stadholderate, no supreme command of the state's army and navy, ever. Cromwell really didn't want a son of a steward wielding any power next door. He might try something when he's all grown up, like, I don't know, invade England? The English were okay with the Dutch request, the Dutch not with the English. Holland and Cromwell saw eye to eye on the prince's matter, so Grand Pensionary de Witt and the Lord Protector concluded secret negotiations and reached an agreement. They added a secret clause, the Act of Seclusion, to the treaty, which only concerned the states of Holland. Toddler Willem would never hold office in Holland, and, well, Holland was all that mattered. Holland trumps Republic, always, am I right? They would also prevent other states from appointing stadholders. The States General was only then brought in the loop. De Witt negotiated hard to get them to agree to the clause, claiming Cromwell had demanded this provision, but historians today aren't too sure about that. Several weeks later, the Dutch ambassadors, who were oblivious to this act of seclusion, finalized the negotiations. The Republic had technically lost the war, but Johan de Witt had secured a remarkably lenient treaty for the Dutch. While the Republic only got a few of their original 36 articles met, Oliver Cromwell was left empty-handed. No political union and no access for the EIC in VOC territory. But he kept the Navigation Act, which the Dutch didn't recognize. Sure, they dipped the colors to English warships in the Channel, but refused to recognize English dominion over said channel. The Dutch also had to punish all those involved in the Amboyna massacre, even though no one was still alive to be punished. Both countries also had to expel exiled rebels of either country. This was a Charles Stuart hit job who packed up and left for the Spanish Netherlands. The Dutch also didn't get their ratification of the 1650 Hartford Treaty, defining the New Netherland-New England border. The Treaty of Westminster was signed on the 5th or 15th of April 1654, depending on your calendar. It was ratified by all parties a week later. While technically it was peace, Johan de Witt was well aware it was really a truce. He felt si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. The Grand Pensionary learned from all the mistakes, pulled out all the stops to establish a proper navy, and prepared the Republic for the next inevitable clash. When the news of peace between England and the Republic was announced in New England, all military campaigns were cancelled, and Cromwell's North American invasion squad was recalled. An elated Director-General Stuyvesant breathed a sigh of relief. The joyous news was proclaimed from New Amsterdam City Hall, accompanied by the ringing of bells and all kinds of public festivities. Stuyvesant announced that the 12th of August was a day of general thanksgiving to God for his great goodness. In his proclamation, the Director-General devoutly exclaimed, "Praise the Lord, O England's Jerusalem and Netherlands Zion, praise ye the Lord. He hath secured your gates and blessed your possessions with peace. Even here, where the threatened torch of war was lighted, where the waves reached our lips and subsided only through the power of the Almighty." Stuyvesant emerged very victorious through it all, and the company had his back all the way. François Le Bleu, the delegate who had brought the rebels' residents' accusations against the Director-General to the Republic, was unable to convince the company to implement reform. The residents' complaints were dismissed as frivolous, and Le Bleu was rather rudely forbidden to return to New Netherland. The directors of the West India Company wrote to Stuyvesant that his administration was A-OK. Yet, he shouldn't have shown so much leniency to the ringleaders of the gang, and he should have responded to their protests with more protests. Be a dear and punish those responsible for what happened, so others would think twice before trying something stupid like this in the future. The company wrote to the New Netherland residents, "We strongly advise you to behave calmly and peacefully, follow the rules set by the government, and avoid having any special meetings or discussions with the English or others about things that don't concern you. Don't try to change the government or how things are run." Stuyvesant fired the Remonstrance culprits, George Baxter and James Hubbard, who then promptly raised the English flag at Gravesend and declared the town subject to England. You know what's gonna happen. Yep, the director sent a military force to Long Island, arrested the Englishmen, and had them locked up at New Amsterdam. Thus ended the rebellion against the rule of Stuyvesant and of the West India Company. But a new war was brewing, not from the north, but from the south. Will this never end? Nope, there's still a few more episodes to go. Onwards. The West India Company never quite got around to properly colonizing the territory on the south aka Delaware River. When the Swedes arrived in 1638, smuggled in by former West India Company director Peter Minuit, they established a colony on the opposite side of the river from the Dutch settlements. As it turned out, theirs was an infinitely better trading spot for the Indians. When the Dutch yelled at them that they had sole ownership of the river, the Swedes, having superior everything, were like, "Sure, buddy, what are you gonna do about it? Yell some more?" All went quiet, with Nieuwe Sverige steadily expanding under Governor Johan Prince's rule. Then there was a disturbance in the force south. Early morning, May 31st, 1654, Sergeant Gerrit Bicker and his garrison of 12 in Fort Casimir saw foreign sails coming up the river. Bicker sent out a sloop with a small scouting party to check it out. It was a Swedish ship, the Örne, the Eagle, filled with several hundred colonists and a new Sweden governor, Johan Claesson Rysing. Prince had apparently lost interest in running the colony. Rysing told them their fort was on land belonging to the Swedish government. And, well, back in Europe, the Dutch and Swedes were embroiled in an informal trade war because Denmark. Really? Wait, really? Yes, really. Bicker only had a small garrison and no ammo. He knew resistance was futile. They would be assimilated. Lieutenant Sven Svensson Skute and some 30 Swedish soldiers disembarked and sauntered up to the fort where Sergeant Bicker stood waiting outside in front of the gate, which was wide open. Skute, a 30 years war veteran, stated he was acting on orders of his government. The territory belonged to Sweden, and that neither the West India Company nor the States General had authorized their Director-General to build a fort there. Next, Bicker let the invaders inside, gave no orders to his men, and allowed the Swedes to disarm the Dutch garrison. The conquerors fired 2 cannons over the fortifications to announce Fort Casimir was captured. Some said the Swedes took the place by storm, and Bicker later claimed he was held at sword point. But, well. Skute, commanding a strong garrison, was left in charge of the fort, which Rysing renamed Fort Trefaldighet, Trinity, since it was taken on Trinity Sunday. The governor told skilled engineer Peter Lindström to pull a crew together to strengthen its fortifications. Now the Swedes controlled the Delaware River and blocked the Dutch colonists' access to the sea. These Dutch were allowed to stay, but they had to live under Swedish rule. 2 days later, Gerrit Bicker, with all the Dutch colonists and soldiers from Zandhoek, now Sandy Hook, New Jersey, arrived at Fort Christina to take the oath of allegiance to the Swedish crown. Next, the governor called together the local tribal chiefs and made a friendship pact with all of them. A month later, Rysing boasted that New Sweden's population had grown to 368 and had plans to block the river completely to all Dutch traffic. Rysing sent a polite letter to Director Stuyvesant. "Hey, I got your fort, I got your fort." This news didn't go over well. Director-General Stuyvesant's rage was only matched by the residents' fury, who gathered at Fort Amsterdam to protest a hostile takeover. "Let's go and grab those Swedes by their little meatballs." Stuyvesant ordered Bicker arrested and wrote the company fuming about the sergeant's cowardly conduct in the dishonorable surrender of the fort. As for the Swedes, to the ships! Okay, not so fast. First, Stuyvesant needed to gather an army and get his hands on some ships. He wrote the West India Company Amsterdam Chamber in charge of the colony to send orders and help, but warned them that these constant threats of war made the New Netherlanders anxious, faint-hearted, and discouraged. Stuyvesant didn't wait for an answer to gather a force. Every day the drums beat in the streets of New Amsterdam calling for volunteers. Commander-in-Chief Stuyvesant personally drilled the reassembled militia companies made up mostly of New Amsterdam residents, with all its officers being residents of that city. Next, Stuyvesant reassembled his Council of War and got them primed and ready to handle any emergencies once he headed out to kick out them Swedes for good.